So we have gone through the chi-squared test statistic in terms of calculating it by hand. In practice, researchers rarely calculate this particular test statistic manually. It is important to do it so that you understand the mechanics of the chi-squared one-way goodness of fit test, because you can see that it really is a function of these observed and expected frequencies or counts, meaning the more different those are, the larger the chi-square test statistic. But once you understand the chi-square one-way goodness of fit test, right, especially if you have a large number of categories, if k is 4, 5, or 20, it's really much more efficient to use statistical software, and that's really the standard. Most people use statistical software, but they still understand the mechanics of the chi-square test statistic. So let's look at the statistical output for this idea of comparing this claim distribution of religious affiliation among young people with the actual observed counts. So let's look at the chi-square one-way goodness of fit test using this particular statistical software. You can see that the statistical software calls it the chi-square test for given probabilities. That's because we can treat proportions in certain contexts as probabilities. For using the chi-square one-way goodness of fit test, the claim distribution of the population, right, those proportions given by the religious studies scholar can be viewed as probabilities. And you can see that we have quite a bit of output here, but the important output for the purposes of our analysis here really concerns the chi-square test statistic. So you can see the chi-square test statistic in the upper left-hand corner. It's roughly 520.39, which is what we calculated by hand. The degrees of freedom is 2. That tells us, that kind of gives us an idea of what the shape of the chi-square distribution model will look like, which is important because our inferences are based on comparing the chi-square test statistic to some critical value or using it to calculate a p-value on a distribution with a shape that is governed by 2 degrees of freedom. And then the statistical software gives us a p-value. It uses scientific notation. All that's really telling us is that the p-value is very, very low. It's almost 0. Right? You can basically round down to 0. It's nearly 0, which tells us that that's much lower than alpha, and it tells us the probability of obtaining the test statistic we observed, which is 520.39, is inconsistent with our null hypothesis. Below all of that information, you can see that we have additional information. The statistical software gives us the observed cell counts and the expected cell counts. It also gives us this measure of what is called the contribution to chi-squared. It's really the contribution to the chi-squared test statistic, and it gives us the residual. Below I show you exactly what this is doing. For the purposes of most analyses, you'll want to focus on the observed and expected cell counts. You can see the observed counts are 247, 132, and 139. That's just our frequency table. And then parentheses, we have these expected cell counts. Those are just the sample size of n times the observed counts for each of those categories. And with that, you have enough information to actually calculate the chi-square test statistic. You can see intuitively what's going on here. 247 versus 310.8, it's fairly large, 132 roughly to 181, that's a pretty large difference. But that last category of 139 versus roughly 26 or 25.9, that's a pretty big difference, right? That's the religious nuns group, right? So the first group is Protestants, the second group is Catholics, and the third group is nuns. And you can see that that difference between the observed and expected cell counts for that last category, right, that is really affecting our calculation for the chi-squared test statistic. So using statistical software, we can reject the null at the alpha of 0.05.